Hi, everybody, and welcome to Mark Overanalyses Film, the podcast where I overanalyze a different film every episode. Today, I'll be looking at 1999's Fight Club. Of course, the first rule of Fight Club is that you do not talk about Fight Club, and that might be because talking about Fight Club is a pretty good way to go about sounding like an idiot. Fight Club is over 20 years old, and yet it's still kind of hard to find much out there that really feels compelling as a complete explanation of what this story really means and how it goes about meaning it. And this is despite the fact that there is source material, the 1996 novel by Chuck Palahniuk. So one of the many things I find so interesting about Fight Club is that it can be such a cultural touchstone and yet remains somewhat inscrutable. And further yet, that somehow I still feel that, at least on some level, if I didn't understand it exactly, I had a sense of it. And I think this is due to its structure, as I'll pick up on later. First though, I look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. At the end, I'll talk about the main things that I learned along the way. Okay, so with all that in mind, I'll begin doing so by asking the 5 key questions about the protagonist. Or the narrator. Or Jack. Or Tyler. Or Cornelius. At least we know his name is not Robert Paulson. Question 1. Whose story is it? Or who is the protagonist? To my mind, this is relatively straightforward, but I have seen people suggest it's Tyler Durden, as in Brad Pitt. For my money though, it has to be the narrator, played by Edward Norton. To keep things simple, I'm mostly going to call him Jack here. Jack is the one whose change defines the film and what it means, at least to my mind. Who is Jack? Well, he's a 30-year-old boy working in an American city for one of those big, faceless American companies. He probably makes a good wage, but it doesn't really matter because he wastes it on buying junk to cover up the gaping chasm of existential dread within. Question 2. What is his life dream? The life dream refers to what it is that the protagonist wants before the story really begins. I think Jack's dream at the start of the film here is to disappear. He daydreams about death, and he is, in many ways, half dead already. How does this dream of disappearing manifest itself? Well, aside from the apparent death wish, he wants to sleep. Really sleep. And sleeping is a kind of temporary disappearing. Question 3. What is his want? Want here refers to the thing which drives the protagonist through Act 2 of the movie. So it needs to be a clear, tangible goal to structure the whole thing. As such, the want here is a SMART goal, in that it is specific, measurable, attainable, just about, relevant, and usually, but not always, time-bound. Act 2 begins with Jack meeting Tyler and going for a beer with him, and it ends with Jack realizing that they're the same person and collapsing from the psychic shock. But what is the SMART goal here? Whether or not this is specific enough now, I think is open to debate, but ultimately what Jack is looking for throughout Act 2 is Tyler's acceptance, for Tyler's embrace, to be subsumed by Durdenism. So Jack's want is something in or around the question, will Jack become just like Tyler? I mean, it could be, will Jack become Tyler, but, we don't really know that's an option yet, so I'm going to go with the first one. Question 4. What is his need? Need refers to the piece of wisdom or human quality that the protagonist needs to learn throughout the story. It is the fundamental change that does or does not occur within the character by the end of the story. So it should be something primal and universal to the human experience. When we first meet Jack, he says he's never fully asleep and never fully awake. At the end, with a gun to his mouth, he says, "My eyes are open," which is kind of like another way of saying, "I'm awake," or "I'm fully conscious." It's a notable change, but why has this happened? Well, one other big thing has changed. he's formed a real connection with someone, Marla. Why exactly I believe this to be his need, I'll get into much more later. Question 5. Does he get what he wants and or what he needs? I think it's fair to say the Fight Club has an unconventionally happy ending, significantly unconventional. And so it makes sense that the protagonist in this scenario would not get what they want, but get what they need. Which is probably why, as grubby and dirty and sordid as Fight Club first appears, it doesn't really leave the viewer feeling down or defeated or depressed. I don't think it does anyways. But then Fight Club is controversial, so I'd like to discuss this aspect in greater detail towards the end. For now though, I've attempted to answer the 5 questions, and I would like to look at Fight Club's sequences. There is normally, but not always, 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length, though, as shown in Fight Club, they can be quite elastic. A good way to think about it though is that every 10 to 15 minutes or so, the audience should on some level be asking themselves a different dramatic question. Now, in the films that I've covered so far in this podcast, the sequences have pretty much perfectly matched up with the 8, sections. But I should note here that Fight Club probably has 10 sequences. So, section 4, which I would term the greater attempts to solve the problem, actually contains the 4th and 5th sequences of Fight Club, while section 6, the bridge from the honeymoon sequence to the low point, contains the 7th and the 8th sequences. If you're to have 10 sequences, I think this placement makes total sense, as I'll get into, but mostly I'll be focusing on the 8 stages. One further point about sequences is that the central tension of a sequence should be introduced promptly, but once it has, there is quite a bit of freedom to move around within that sequence. With all that said, let's look at the 10 sequences and 8 stages of Fight Club. Act 1 contains the first 2 sequences. Sequence 1 is generally some version of life as it is for the main characters before the events of the film take place. Now, Fight Club has one of those begins at the end kind of beginnings, which I generally think is kind of a cheat, but it is undeniably effective, and here it really does make sense to introduce the narration. Once we've been introduced to where we're going to end up and just how crazy things are going to get, the narrator tells us how all of this has to do with a girl called Marla Singer. We then see that Jack was suffering with insomnia and working a dehumanizing job. Importantly, this is closely tied to his unchecked consumerism. He keeps buying crap, and his is a shallow existence, devoid of the texture of suffering, connection, and real meaning, even while he categorizes pain and suffering in his job. There's a lot of interesting cause and effect relationships in Fight Club, and I think one of the first ones is that he's never fully awake because he can't sleep, but he arguably can't sleep because he's never fully awake. The way he learns to cope with this is to attend support groups. At these groups, he says, "I found freedom. Losing all hope was freedom." Now, to my mind, that's not what's actually happening here, but it's great characterization that that's how he sees it. There's a tremendous amount of dramatic power in a protagonist learning the wrong lesson from something. But rather than losing all hope, to my mind at least, what's happening here is he's actually still clinging to pride. These people are opening up and supporting each other. He first cries because Bob embraces him. A human connection is what allows him to cry. But at this point, it's an imperfect mechanism for connecting with people. He's lying, which protects him, so this connection is dubious. It's insecure. And then, sequence 2 begins with the introduction of Marla Singer. This is a classic inciting incident, the event without which our story as it is would not happen. Marla, in copying his lie, ruins everything for Jack. So we pondered the sequence to tension, will Jack get rid of Marla? A quick note, Marla here is a threat because she strains the lie within Jack's coping mechanism, which is exactly what she will do again throughout Act 2. So after attempting to ignore her for a while, Jack eventually confronts her and works out a deal, which is again pretty similar to what he'll do later. But something in her intrusion to his life has raised his discomfort. We as an audience don't go back to groups after this deal is struck. We now see Jack increasingly waking up in strange places. And eventually, he wakes up beside Tyler Durden. Right after having an intense death fantasy, he is beguiled. Now, where exactly you want to draw the end of Act 1 and the start of Act 2 here is, not really that important. But at 24 minutes, Jack himself tells the audience what we're going to see. The story of how he came to live with Tyler. So if we put this in question form, we have our next dramatic tension. Within 3 minutes, Jack will get home to find his condo ablaze. One thing I always find interesting here is that he looks at his destroyed furniture strewn about the pavement, and his takeaway is, a house full of condiments and no food. How embarrassing. What a weird thing to worry about right now. But of course, that kind of fear of other people's judgments is exactly what's driving him to Tyler. Anyways, by now, we're starting Act 2, which begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. So, really here we're seeing how Jack is introduced to Tyler's world, and how he decided to stay there. But before he does so, there is an easily overlooked detail that is also notably not in the script, and I'll discuss why it isn't a bit later. Before he calls Tyler, Jack calls Marla, but when she answers, he doesn't speak. The fact that he chooses in this moment to speak to himself rather than to Marla is the character's flaw put into action. What follows then is our full introduction to Tyler and a classic what's the plan scene, which introduces us to what Act 2 is all about.
It's all going down, man. So fuck off with your sofa units and string green stripe patterns. I say never be complete. I say stop being perfect. I say let's evolve. Let the chips fall where they may.
And they have their first fight. And they love it. Then we basically have a long montage of Jack getting used to Paper Street and the beginnings of what will soon be termed Fight Club. This sequence ends though with a really important conversation. Tyler and Jack talk about how they were abandoned by their dads and left to be raised by women. They feel abandoned by masculinity. And this discomfiture with masculinity is arguably what leads to their fear of women and femininity. Jack says he can't get married because he's a 30-year-old boy. Tyler wonders if another woman is really the answer they need. We're about to move out of this sequence, but I want to point out 2 things here. One, in just a few minutes, Jack is going to start seriously singing the virtues of Fight Club.
A guy came to Fight Club for the first time. His ass was a wad of cookie dough. After a few weeks, he was carved out of wood.
By this logic, I'm pretty sure Jack should already be carved out of wood. But apparently, he's still a boy. While he achieves a physical confidence and expression, he remains emotionally stunted. How many fights will it take for you to be an actual man, Jack? On a similar note, right before Fight Club is officially introduced, Jack happens to see Marla. At the same time, he's talking about how his problem in life had been that he hadn't been angry enough. In the next scene, he says all he could think about was the next fight. He is not, he protests, thinking about Marla. Once Tyler introduces the rules of Fight Club, we really have little doubt that this is Jack's life now. So we've answered the first tension, but this is only the end of sequence 3, and sequence 4 will begin with the character's first unconscious move towards their need. And it really is unconscious here. 20 minutes ago, he rang Marla and didn't speak. Now Marla calls him, and Tyler takes up where Jack leaves off. Who's interested in Marla? Not Jack, but maybe Tyler, who is, let me check my notes, also Jack. Sequence 4, or Section 4, as I'll call it here, as it actually contains 2 sequences, is defined as greater attempts to solve the problem. It's fairly common in a film over 2 hours to have 2 sequences here, I think. Act 1 generally can't be much longer than 30 minutes, or we'd get restless waiting for the story to begin. And we could do with the protagonist making their first unconscious move towards their need, or to accept the call, by the 40 or 45 minute mark, because that's when they tend to really get in on the adventure. Once that happens though, we have a bit of breathing space before we need to hit the midpoint, because our story is fully up and running. Anyways, Marla has come back into his life, and the question of this sequence becomes some variation of, will Jack make peace with Marla? This sequence is dominated by Tyler and Marla's crazy sex, while frustrated Jack gets more hostile at work. Note, this means he is having sex with Marla, and he's getting more aggressive with those around him. He's going to greater lengths to deal with the problem. Someone's getting closer, so he's pushing people away. The cops are also now suspecting foul play with his apartment. This sequence comes to a close when Marla makes a sexual pass at Jack, and he basically calls her trash. You can find this scene easily online, by the way, and note how, as Marla talks about the condom being the glass slipper of their generation, how much it looks like Jack is masturbating. He's furiously scrubbing something, but initially not looking at it. He's holding it right by his crotch, but he's staring blankly, mouth agape into the distance. This is, no accident. The closer she gets, the more aggressive he scrubs, until he dismisses her. She storms off and we begin our next sequence, which is defined by the question, will Jack and Tyler make soap? This isn't a dramatic question, but it doesn't have to be. What's dramatic is what happens while they're making the soap, the how and the why of it all. What soap represents in Fight Club could probably be a whole podcast in and of itself, but there's some key elements to consider. Firstly, the first soap, according to Tyler, was created through human sacrifice. Cleansing came through sacrifice. Secondly, Marla has made a pass at Jack, and this is a way for him to get revenge on women. Just watch Jack's face when he says, "It was beautiful. We were selling rich women their own fat asses back to them." I don't think he looks so contemptuous at any other point. These two elements combine in one of the most iconic moments in the film, the chemical burn. As Tyler burns his hand, his last refuge is a fantasy about Marla. Tyler literally slaps him across the face. The idea is to focus on the pain, not on God, not on Marla. Tyler might be talking about God, but his essential point is he doesn't need approval, or shouldn't at least.
Listen to me. You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you. He never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
We don't need him.
We don't agree. I got it.
Fuck damnation, man. Fuck redemption. We are God's unwanted children. So be it.
There's a connection drawn here, which is throughout the film, that if you can take the physical pain, you can somehow numb yourself to emotional pain or emotional need. In the earlier scene with Marla, there's already been a connection made between cleansing and masturbation as a means of rejecting others, especially women. But the film is eventually going to prove this to be false, And that process begins in earnest as we reach the midpoint, or the character's first conscious move towards his need. So, at the start of Act 2, Jack called Marla but didn't speak. Sequence 4 begins with Marla ringing him and him leaving her potentially to die. Now, Marla calls Jack at work and he takes it. And when she asks him to come over to check for a lump on her breast, he does so. He goes over and the tone is different now. Like with the groups earlier, the shadow of death looms here, but these two actually know each other. So Marla's tenderness is real and directed right at who he is. No pseudonym, no Tyler, no dodge. Now, Jack is not ready to accept this, so he beats a hasty retreat. But something begins to happen here. Something that will define Section 5, or here, Sequence 6, the honeymoon sequence. The honeymoon sequence is when the character starts acting in accordance with their need. And in this case, Jack and Tyler begin to drift apart. Tyler gives his most famous speech.
God damn it, an entire generation pumping gas, waiting tables, slaves with white collars. Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
And then starts giving out homework assignments. This moment really stuck out for me when I first watched Fight Club as a kid, because it's so shrouded in darkness and mystery, and it really is notable how much of a shift it is. What Tyler is up to is now suddenly beyond Jack's knowledge, and so we're left with the question, will Jack find out why Tyler is giving them homework assignments? Everyone goes out and picks fights, and the hijinks get wilder and wilder. And you can hear it in the music, can't you? This is fun at this point, because like Jack, we're not too concerned about where all this is going yet. And speaking of Jack, we have another iconic scene where he beats himself up in front of his boss. He says himself that he thought of his first fight with Tyler, but he no longer needs Tyler to do this, you might notice. This sequence begins to turn, though, with a trip to the convenience store. It's hard to ignore how compelling Tyler is in the scene with Raymond K. Hessel. It's probably Tyler's most compelling argument, and it ropes Jack right back in.
You had to give it to him.
Come on.
He had a plan, and it started to make sense in a Tyler sort of way. No fear, no distractions. The ability to let that which does not matter truly slide.
A bit like the first three sequences, there's generally something of a time limit on the honeymoon section. Films are built on conflict, so while the next section can have multiple sequences, it's rare that a honeymoon period can last too long. And this sequence ends in the next full scene, where Jack tries being softer with Marla, but this softness immediately leads to issues for him, because she starts asking questions. The moment she does, Tyler starts drilling in Jack's head and puppet masters him into shutting her out again. Then, applicants start turning up at the door. And so we find out why Tyler was giving out homework assignments, because Tyler is building an army. And so we enter Section 6, the bridge from the honeymoon sequence to the low point. And we begin with the first of two sequences here, number 7 now, and its question, will Jack find out why Tyler is building an army? As I've said previously, this section is normally full of troubles, and that is very much the case here. Jack has seemed pretty comfortable with letting Tyler get a little bit away from him, but that changes here. As soon as Tyler has a few space monkeys on the go, he starts blowing stuff up. And Jack is horrified. He realizes how out of step he is when he asks what's going on, and the others laugh at his questioning. I also love in this scene how boyish Jared Leto's angel face seems in being attracted to the reporter on TV. I don't know if this is a reach, but it might be worth noting that within 4 minutes of commenting on the attractiveness of a woman, Jack beats the living shit out of him. But that might be a reach because there is, of course, another reason for him doing this. Tyler has shown him favoritism. And this is where the counter-argument relationship is really rich, I think. Jack is really trying to not need other people, to not need acceptance. But when Tyler shows favoritism to another, he becomes enraged, the only emotion that he's developing. It might be tempting to try and not need approval, but it is in the end impossible. Jack pounds Angelface, but he can't overcome the emotional hurt within. Jack and Tyler leave and go for a drive. Jack eventually confronts Tyler about being left out, and Tyler, rather than letting him in, tells him to let go. He also, notably, reveals that he was the one who blew up his condo, which would seem like a huge reveal if it wasn't only part of an even bigger reveal coming down the road. It's also worth noting thematically here that in his mind, Jack is literally a passenger in this scene, with Tyler at the wheel. Tyler convinces Jack to fully let go, but of course Jack letting go is actually Tyler taking more control. They crash, and as Jack recuperates in a semi-coma, Tyler explains that he has a vision for the world, and then he abandons Jack. So, will Jack find out why Tyler is building an army? Yes. Tyler wants to destroy civilization, and to think all Jack really needed was a girlfriend. But at that we have a new question for our 8th sequence. Will Jack find Tyler? At this point he's been rejected. He points out himself that Tyler has abandoned him, just like his dad did. But as dejected as he is, he's not quite at his lowest ebb yet, and he still wants to be reunited with Tyler. He wanders around, a stranger in his own house. He unwittingly rejects Marla, and then he sees his one real friend killed. You know, what's his name? He resolves to chase down Tyler all over the country, but he can't find him and he can't figure out why. And then we have the reveal. But it's such a big reveal that we are actually told it 3 times. The bartender calls him Tyler Durden, then Marla over the phone calls him Tyler Durden, then finally, in conversation with Tyler himself, Jack finally admits to himself that we're the same person. There's a few things worth pointing out here. This is the end of the second act, the low point or the moment where the counter-argument is at its strongest, you could also say. So, first of all, Jack refuses to face reality. He refutes this situation as impossible. Second of all, Tyler says, "We simply do not have time for this crap." And Jack collapses, as if on cue. It really seems as though Tyler is in total control. Finally, the thing that really ends the dramatic question of Act 2, will Jack become just like Tyler? The thing that finally pits Jack against Tyler is Marla. The last thing they talk about is Tyler's threat to Marla's life. We know that Jack can't let this happen, and so it not only answers the central tension of Act 2, it also gives us the first dramatic tension of Act 3. Will Jack save Marla before Tyler gets to her? Quick aside, Tyler, you'll notice, has shaved his head to fully embrace Durdenism, but Jack hasn't. It's a small visual cue, I think, to show the answer to the central Act 2 tension. Moving on to Act 3 though. Act 3 is made up of 2 sequences, the false resolution and the true resolution. Something I find interesting here is that the first of these sequences is often dominated by the protagonist being lost and feeling dejected. But that was actually in the last sequence in Act 2. Here, Jack is full of action from the get-go, but it remains something of a low point because everything now feels so stacked against him. His conscious self, his agency, seems no match for his unconscious. The only thing he does accomplish is to have a huge fight with Marla. She says she's done because, you'll notice, he's still withholding. He tells her life is in danger, but he won't say why. And so she gets on a bus, destination unknown, and theoretically leaves his life forever. At this point, his solution is still to separate himself from others, the height and end of the false resolution. There's one question left, and so we're in our true resolution with our final tension. Will Jack stop Tyler? It's maybe worth a quick mention here how good Fincher is at pacing and, I'm going to say, muscular storytelling. There's lots of stuff that does not make sense in this movie. Really, almost everything when you think about it. But it's insane that when Jack goes to the police, that almost all the cops are in on the plot. And that they're planning to cut off his balls in the middle of the police station with their boss outside the room? What does the next 30 minutes of that plan look like? Anyways, he escapes, and for some reason, none of that bothers me at all. And now he has no option but to try and stop Tyler in person. Whether it's because he's coming to terms with his psychic need or because he's appropriately motivated, Tyler has less control over Jack, it seems, at this point. Which is good news for Jack as it means he's able to defuse the bomb, but bad news for Jack as it means that Tyler gives him one hell of a beating. And then we get back, finally, to where we were at the beginning. Once again, we have a couple of things combining here. The impending arrival of Marla prompts Jack into action, but also he accepts responsibility or agency for all of it. He puts a gun to his head and tells Tyler, "My eyes are open." Another way of saying, "I'm fully awake." Now, the fact that he shoots himself through the mouth, but the bullet kills Tyler is one of those all-timer matter of opinion type dealies. If one were so inclined, you could make the argument that he has indeed learned from Tyler that a willingness to lose everything is freedom. He has also been slowly developing a greater capacity for risk and pain through the film. First fighting, then a chemical burn, then a car crash. Ultimately, though, it is this feeling of agency, that he has accepted his agency and taken control, that is the key component. And what has spurred him to do so? In my view, Marla. And that's because of what happens next. Marla joins him, and notably, he sends the men away. As Tyler's plans blow up in their faces, he takes her hand and tells her, with one of the all-time great final lines,
Trust me. Everything's gonna be fine.
You met me at a very strange time in my life.
My goodness, what a movie, what an ending. I could wax lyrical about Fight Club all day, but I'd like to focus on two related aspects in particular. First of all, I'd like to talk about the hidden importance of Marla. It took me a while to figure out the structure of Fight Club. It was only when I really focused on the question of what choices the narrator makes that I really got it. It's a basic question for sure, but surprisingly easy to overlook. With Tyler, Jack is largely following and or observing, and Tyler is such a larger-than-life figure that he's hard not to get distracted by. But the scenes where Jack makes decisions are the ones with Marla, and these decisions map his trajectory. At the end of Act 1, he calls her but doesn't speak. At the end of Sequence 3, she calls him but he chooses to leave her to die if he believes her. When she makes a pass at him, he calls her trash. At the midpoint, though, she asks for help and he comes. He's brusque, but soon tries to be softer with her. He feels guilty. When this leaves an opening for vulnerability, though, he goes with Tyler and shuts her out again, ending the honeymoon sequence. He then rejects her without realizing when he himself feels rejected by Tyler's absence, thinking that she's not really interested in him. Then he rejects Durdenism when Tyler threatens her life. I think part of the reason why this didn't stand out immediately is that many of Fight Club's sequence tensions are not directly about Marla. If there are 6 sequence tensions in Act 2 as I've outlined here, only the second of the 6 is obviously based around Marla. The others chasing the dream of Tyler. But on reflection, these others are largely caused by Marla. Jack creates Tyler after Marla invades his groups. He moves in with him to avoid speaking to Marla. He burns himself shortly after Marla makes a sexual advance on him. All of Tyler's actions could be viewed as a reaction to Marla's. And I think this is why, as I said earlier, that I felt like I understood Fight Club without really being able to put my finger on exactly why. The film hides Jack's growth towards his need in plain sight while distracting us with the dynamism and pizzazz of Tyler and the exponential growth and menace of Project Mayhem. There is another point to note on this. It's different in Jim Yule's script. In Yule's script, Jack doesn't call Marla at the end of Act 1. Many events are moved around, but most fascinating to my mind is that the midpoint is the Raymond K. Hessel scene. This plays out quite like the film scene, except for the notable fact that Tyler tells Jack at this point that he blew up his condo. This then becomes Jack's first conscious move towards his need. And at the end of Act 2, Tyler does not threaten Marla's life. There's more, but I think this gets to the point. In the script, Marla is much more the reward that Jack gets for attaining his need. The fact that in rewrites, Fincher et al. Decided to shape the story much more around Marla is a clear sign that they made a conscious decision to make her the cause for Jack's change, rather than their relationship just being the result of it. In this way, in the film, if not in Jim Yule's script, Marla represents the argument of the film. Now, this idea of argument is something I am especially keen on discussing in Fight Club. We are presented with a problem. Jack is somnambulant, feeling untethered from everyone else and from feeling much of just about anything. And then he looks to the counter-argument of the film, personified by Tyler. If you can just rid yourself of your need for others, says Tyler. If you can just purify yourself of emotional need through pain, you can be free. Now, there's a reason why Tyler Durden is so iconic and quotable. There's some real appeal to a lot of what he's saying, especially to dispossessed young men who are not that emotionally literate. But the important point here is that Tyler's is the counter-argument. And for the argument or thesis to be truly proven, it should be tested by the strongest form of its counter-argument. We've all seen that film where, the girl has a choice between the rich snob and the work-in-progress soulmate. And lo and behold, she chooses her soulmate. Now, that's an argument of sorts, but while it's often comforting, I don't mind those movies, it's never actually convincing. Because the so-called counter-argument is too busy shouting at a waiter, or obviously flirting with other women, or being Bill Pullman to ever actually pose a problem to the argument. So, for a really good story to work, we need a real counter-argument. But there is something else to note. The very talented screenwriter Hugh Travers once told me a story to illustrate a point. A monster comes to a village. The hero trains and trains. Eventually, the time has come to do battle. If the hero wins the battle, the story is about bravery and hard work overcoming any obstacle. If the hero loses the battle, well, it's a story about hubris and knowing your limitations. It's a great illustration of the fact that endings define stories. At the end of Fight Club, Jack rejects Tyler. He sends the men away to be alone, open, and vulnerable with Marla. This is the argument, and a rejection of the counter-argument. Now, I can understand to some extent the controversy around Fight Club, but personally, I'm glad that Fight Club makes the counter-argument as compellingly as it can. It's why Fight Club is great and so iconic. These dark impulses are real and present, And Jack really does use elements of this counter-argument or antithesis to overcome his initial problem. But while Jack is beguiled by Tyler for most of the film, the key point is that he rejects Tyler at the end of the story and chooses Marla and the argument of human connection. And so I'm not only told by Fight Club, but I am convinced by Fight Club that things really can get dark, and modern life really can be tiring and isolating and desensitizing and dehumanizing. And despite all of that, we still need each other, and we can still find each other. And that, for my money, is the message and the power of Fight Club. This has been Mark Overanalyses Film on Fight Club. In the next episode, I'll be looking at selfishness, death, and obsession in the family movie Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, whatever else it is that's good for this kind of thing. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.